I met Sharon and saw him kill 2 children before my eyes. The well-known Dutch Jewish director George Sluizer witnessed then Israeli defense minister, who was later to become the Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, killing 2 Palestinian toddlers with a pistol in 1982 near the refugee camp Sabra-Shatila while filming a documentary there. It might appear a bit odd that such a high official would behave so overtly like a gangster, but Sharon had always been a rather uninhibited fellow. A bit like Reinhard Heydrich, the Nazi butcher of Czechoslovakia, who also was fond of brandishing a pistol openly. According to Howard Sacker, at the outset of the Israeli war in Lebanon, Prime Minister Begin had characterized Palestinian insurgents as animals on 2 legs. Israeli Chief of General Staff Rafael Eitan termed Arab demonstrators in the West Bank drugged roaches. This language reeks of dehumanization, the essential companion of genocide. The Nazis had used a similar lexicon against the Jews, Gypsies, Poles, and Communists. Now, it seemed that the Nazi demons had resurrected in the ancient land of Palestine. But instead of names like Himmler, Heydrich, and Goebbels, their names resembled some of those who had been victims of the Nazis. I am Dr. Hassan Bukhari, and this is the 23rd episode of our series, Palestine versus Israel. In 1975, Lebanon erupted into a civil war. There were 2 principal factors behind this war: the intricate and unstable political and demographic structure of Lebanon, and the influx of a huge amount of Palestinian resistance operatives who entered Lebanon after getting ousted from Jordan in 1970-71. According to historian David Gilmour, by 1971, Lebanon was the one remaining country from which the guerrillas could attack Israel. In the 1967 war, they had lost their few bases in Egyptian-controlled territory. In 1970 and 71, they were driven out of Jordan. And in Syria, their freedom of movement was almost entirely restricted. But in Lebanon, where the government was too weak to suppress it, the resistance was allowed to do what it liked. More than 300,000 Palestinian refugees were living in squalor in Lebanon as well. Now the Palestinian Liberation Organization, utilizing the funds donated by Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Sheikdoms, took charge of the welfare of these refugees and created a state within a state in Lebanon by taking advantage of the politically fractured nature of the country. This Palestinian quasi-state not only ran an autonomous economy and industry, it also had a sizable army of several thousand soldiers with some light artillery and armored vehicles as well. Lebanon's population was divided into 3 groups almost equal in number. There were the Maronites, who were Christian and the most socially advantaged. The Maronites had been clients of the French colonialists in the days of the French mandate over Lebanon, and the French had promulgated a formula according to which Maronites had ensured 6-5 dominance over the Muslims in the assembly, irrespective of demographic realities. The Muslims were almost twice as numerous as the Maronites, but they were almost equally divided between the Sunni and Shia sects. Lastly, there were the Druze, who were very warlike but few in number and followed their own separate religion. All these factions invoked a common Arab identity as well. The Muslims had been pushing for a census and redistribution of political power according to the population since the French departure in the 1940s, but the Maronites had fiercely and somewhat successfully resisted this. The influx of the Palestinians, though, changed the situation and made the Maronites insecure of a Muslim alliance between the Lebanese Muslims and Palestinians. The Lebanese Army's officer corps was dominated by Maronites, but the rank and file had a huge majority of Muslims. The Maronite leadership was apprehensive of the Muslim soldiers of the army. So, they created their own militias in the 1970s and gave them the name of Lebanese forces, or the Alaf. The Phalangist militia, headed by the Jamal family, and the Tigers militia, linked to former President Camille Chamoun, were most significant amongst these forces. Another independent militia, raised by a renegade Lebanese officer, Saad Haddad, operated in South Lebanon and was heavily supported by Israel. On the 13th of April 1975, Phalangist soldiers massacred 27 Palestinians in Beirut. The Phalangists also started shelling the Palestinian refugee camp of Tel Za'atar. Thus began the long and bloody Lebanese civil war. David Gilmour writes, "To remove an irritant, and the Palestinian presence could certainly be irritating, the Maronites gave the country a civil war. For they badly miscalculated. Nobody was taken in by their propaganda, least of all the other Lebanese, most of whom joined the enemy. Nor was their reliance on the army justified. It did split, and in the event, its more effective elements took the field against them. The Maronites were thus left fighting it out by themselves, and they lost. Only the intervention of a foreign army prevented their total defeat. The first foreign intervention in the Lebanese civil war was undertaken by the Syrian president Hafiz al-Assad. Assad didn't want the Palestinians to defeat the Maronites and gain total control of Lebanon. He wanted to maintain a balance of power between different factions, with Syria in the position of hegemon. So, in late 1975, he dispatched significant Syrian forces to Lebanon. According to Gilmour, Assad could not afford to let Lebanon degenerate into complete anarchy. Though allied to the Palestinians, he could not afford a total victory for the Jumblat PLO front, which would almost certainly lead to an Israeli invasion and which might also have repercussions on the stability of his own regime within Syria itself. Nor could he allow the Maronites to set up a state which might ally itself with Israel. His only option, therefore, was to arrange a compromise and impose it on the Lebanese. The Syrians blockaded the flow of arms and other supplies to the Palestinians and also dissuaded their Shia allies from aiding the Palestinians. Thus, the Maronites gained some respite and retook some territory. On the 12th of August 1976, the Phalangists won another significant victory and overran the refugee camp of Tal Za'atar. They celebrated their victory with a horrific massacre of more than 1,000 people, including women and children. Interestingly, the Syrian intervention had come about as a result of a US brokered deal between Syria and Israel. According to Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi, with the explicit approval of the United States, Syria launched a direct military assault on the PLO in Lebanon in 1976, as the civil war there was already underway. While Washington and Syria were working towards an understanding about this intervention, Kissinger clarified US objectives. We could let the Syrians move and break the back of the PLO. This was, he said, a strategic opportunity which we shall miss. In the end, the United States did not let the opportunity slip away, and Syrian troops engaged in pitched battles with Palestinian commandos in Sidon and the Shuf Mountains and elsewhere. The Syrian intervention was only made possible after Kissinger persuaded Israel not to oppose it, via a tacit agreement on red lines that set geographical limits to the Syrian advance. This red line prevented the Syrians and their allies from moving forces in southern Lebanon beyond the area east of the port of Tyre. In this zone, the Israeli-sponsored militia of Saad Haddad, named the South Lebanon Army, operated. From 1976 onwards, Israel also started backing the dreadful Phalangists. According to Howard Sacker, in March 1976, Abu Halil, a spokesman for the Phalange, largest of the Maronite factions, boarded an Israeli missile boat off the Lebanese coast. Carried to Haifa, he met there with Prime Minister Rabin and Foreign Minister Alon. Muslim forces were about to overrun the Maronite-inhabited Mount Lebanon range, Abu Halil explained. Could Israel provide the Christians with some form of emergency aid? Rabin and Alon were sympathetic. Within the week, they dispatched 2 Israeli intelligence officers to a Lebanese coastal inlet to meet secretly with Bashir Gemayel, youthful commander of the Falangist militia and son of Sheikh Pierre Gemayel, the Falangist patriarch. Israeli author Ronan Bergman has mentioned in his book Rise and Kill First that the Falangists were so vicious that even the Israelis referred to them as a pack of wild dogs. Nevertheless, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin spent $150 million on weapons and supplies for the Falangists and Saad Haddad's South Lebanon army till June 1977, when Menachem Begin replaced him as PM. Begin further augmented the Israeli support for Maronites. In December 1980, he promised the Falangist leader Bashir Gemayel an aerial umbrella and full support in time of need. In July 1971, Israel and the PLO forces engaged in intense skirmishes on the Lebanon-Israel border. The fighting stopped on the 25th of July 1981 when US Presidential Envoy Philip Habib managed to negotiate a ceasefire. The Israeli hawks led by Begin were supremely disappointed at the loss of this opportunity to wreck the PLO in Lebanon. A few days later, in August 1981, Begin named Ariel Sharon as his defense minister, who started planning an invasion of Lebanon. The Israeli aims were simple: complete destruction of PLO forces, which would lead to the demise of the Palestinian nationalism in the occupied West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, and the creation of a client government led by Maronites in Lebanon that would recognize Israel and end the raids into Israel from Lebanese territory once and for all. In January 1982, Ariel Sharon secretly visited Beirut and met the Falangist leader Bashir Gemayel. He told Gemayel that Israel was ready to invade Lebanon if the Falangists were ready to partner with it and take over Beirut after the Israeli invasion. Gemayel readily agreed. Now all Israel required was an excuse to invade. It got that soon. On the 3rd of June 1982, Shlomo Argov, the Israeli ambassador to Britain, was attacked and gravely wounded by gunmen belonging to an organization called the Palestine National Liberation Movement. The organization was headed by Sabri al-Banna, alias Abu Nidal, who was bitterly opposed to Yasser Arafat and had even attempted to assassinate him. According to Howard Sacker, the PNLM in fact was trained by Iraqi intelligence, and its undisguised objective was to provoke the Israelis into an attack on the PLO in Lebanon. Nevertheless, when the Mossad presented this information to Begin, the Prime Minister declined to reveal it to his cabinet. Begin and Sharon had got their opportunity, and they wouldn't let trivialities like nuance and truth come in their way. On the 6th of June 1982, Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee, and 80,000 Israeli troops stormed Lebanon. The invading forces were brutal and ruthless. According to David Gilmour, the devastation had been astounding. Israel subsequently claimed that great care had been taken to avoid civilian casualties, but it was hardly a claim that could be seriously taken by Western television audiences. You only had to look at news bulletins and see the debris of shattered Sidon to realize the extent of Israeli care. Most of Tyre had similarly been razed, as well as the large refugee camp of Ain al-Hilwa. A fortnight after the invasion had started, the International Red Cross estimated that 14,000 people had been killed and 20,000 wounded. the great majority of them Lebanese and Palestinian civilians who had been the victims of Israeli air attacks. Operation Peace for Galilee had become simply a massacre, although Israel and its apologists in the West continued to deny it. Israeli forces reached the outskirts of Beirut on the 10th of June after some serious fighting and began the siege of Beirut, which lasted for 7 weeks. Muslim-dominated West Beirut was almost completely destroyed. According to Rashid Khalidi, the offensive culminated in a 7-week siege of Beirut that finally ended with a ceasefire on August 12. During the siege, entire apartment buildings were obliterated and large areas devastated in the western half of the already badly damaged city. Nearly 50,000 people were killed or wounded in Beirut and the rest of Lebanon, while the siege constituted the most serious attack by a regular army on an Arab capital since World War II. It was not to be equaled until the US occupation of Baghdad in 2003. Interestingly, the massive Israeli bombardment almost entirely resulted in civilian casualties. Rashid Khalidi, who himself was in Beirut those days, reported that not one of the PLO's several functioning underground command and control posts or its multiple communication centers was ever hit. Nor was a single PLO leader killed in the attacks, although many civilians died when the Israeli Air Force missed its targets. Israel's backers, though, weren't going to be deterred by the Nazi-esque barbarity of their ally. USA, the leading advocate of human rights, provided billions of dollars in military aid to Israel in 1981 and 1982. US supplied F-16 fighter bombers, M113 armored personnel carriers, 155mm and 175mm artillery, air-to-ground missiles, and cluster munitions were used by Israel to humanely kill thousands of hapless civilians, including women and children. Apparently, the USA had accepted the Israeli narrative of dehumanization and had ruled that Palestinian, not being human, didn't qualify for any succor in the name of human rights. The Israeli carnage only stopped when a ceasefire was reached on the 12th of August. All the PLO forces were required to leave Lebanon quickly, while Israel refused to give any guarantee of safety for the Palestinian civilian population as a quid pro quo for the PLO's evacuation. On the 23rd of August, Bashir Jamal was elected the president of Lebanon, and it seemed that Israel's invasion of Lebanon was proceeding successfully despite the heavy losses. Israel had lost 450 killed, including a major general, and more than 2,000 wounded since June. But Bashir Jamal, who had refused to act as an Israeli puppet anyway after the assumption of office, was assassinated in a bomb blast on the 14th of September. Israeli forces promptly broke the ceasefire agreement and occupied western Beirut. 2 days later, on the 16th of September, Falangist militiamen entered the Sabra neighborhood of Beirut and the adjacent Palestinian refugee camp of Shatila and began a horrific massacre that went on for 2 days. According to Rashid Khalidi, 2 shaken American journalists, Lauren Jenkins and Jonathan Randall of the Washington Post, among the first Westerners to enter the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, came to tell us what they had seen. They had been with Ryan Crocker, who was the first American diplomat to file a report on what the 3 of them witnessed, the hideous evidence of a massacre. Throughout the previous night, we learned, the flares fired by the Israeli army had illuminated the camps for the Alaf militias, whom it had sent there to mop up as they slaughtered defenseless civilians. Between September 16 and the morning of September 18, the militiamen murdered more than 1,300 Palestinian and Lebanese men, women, and children. Jenkins later won a Pulitzer Prize for his brave reporting. Professor Charles Smith wrote about the massacre and the Israeli involvement in it. After paying their condolences to the Jamal clan and consulting with their staff and Falangist leaders, Sharon and the Israeli Chief of General Staff Raphael Eitan, without informing the Israeli cabinet, ordered Israeli troops into West Beirut in violation of the truce negotiated by Philip Habib. The Israeli military command then arranged for Falangist militias, numbering about 200, to be transported to the area surrounding the camps, which they entered at 6 p.m. on September 16. Though the ostensible purpose was to wipe out an estimated 2,000 PLO fighters, the small number of Maronite forces suggests differently. Aided by Israeli flares to assist them at night, the Phalangists undertook a massacre of Palestinians that continued until the morning of September 19. High-level officers ignored word of the atrocities which emerged on September 17, as apparently did Chief of Staff Etan when told of the events in Beirut on the afternoon of September 18. He and his staff approved a Phalange request to remain in the camps until the next morning. The Maronites exited on September 19, leaving behind at least 800 dead, none apparently members of any PLO unit, and a majority of them women and children. The Sabra-Shatila massacre was so brazen and horrific that even Israeli public opinion was shocked. Perturbed by the huge protests, Israeli Prime Minister Begin appointed a commission of inquiry under the chairmanship of Yitzhak Kahan, President of the Supreme Court, to quell the protests. The PLO's departure from Lebanon created a vacuum that was readily filled by Syria and its proxies. During the Israeli invasion, the Syrians had tried to stay clear of major fighting. After fighting a couple of battles with the Israelis, they had accepted a ceasefire on the 11th of June 1982. The Syrian army remained in control of a significant chunk of Lebanon after the ceasefire, as the Israelis got embroiled in Beirut. Howard Sacker writes, "Frozen in their tracks now by concomitant Syrian military emplacement, Israeli troops each day were exposed to the depredations of PLO and Lebanese Muslim snipers. As early as October 1982, when discussions first began with the Amin Jamal government, 6 Israeli soldiers were killed and 22 wounded in an ambush outside Beirut. Even the Shia of the south, who had not initially challenged the Israeli presence, now joined the attacks. Elsewhere, Druze snipers in the Shuf range also began taking their toll of Israeli personnel. Then, on November 1, an explosion rocked Israel's military headquarters building in Tyre. In the single worst military disaster in Israel's history, 74 soldiers and civilians were killed outright, with another 27 wounded. Sacker further mentions, by spring 1984, more than 600 Israeli lives had been lost, with 3 times that many wounded, casualties that exceeded those of the 1956 Sinai campaign. If the PLO infrastructure had been shattered, the war had left Syria's armed forces intact and significantly more dominant Lebanon than before the Israeli invasion. Emplaced in fully 35% of the little country, the Syrians were investing an immense effort in improving their anti-aircraft system. Any future Israeli campaign in central eastern Lebanon was likely to be far more difficult and costly. It is said that tyrants create their own worst enemies. Israel's present nemesis, the Lebanese Shia force Hezbollah, was also created in 1982 in the heyday of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. With mounting casualties and a curt refusal to recognize Israel or even toe its dictated policy by Amin Jamal, the brother of Bashir Jamal and his successor as president of Lebanon, Israel began to cut its losses and retreat from most of Lebanon, leaving Syria as somewhat of a victor in the Lebanon conflict. In 1990, the Lebanese civil war ended. South Lebanon remained under Israeli occupation, but the rest of the country fell under the domination of Syria and allies like Hezbollah. Hezbollah continued harassing Israel, and finally Israel also withdrew from South Lebanon in 2000. The Israeli puppet South Lebanon army was then completely wiped off by Hezbollah. Lastly, it is pertinent to note that Israel's brutal Lebanese adventure failed in its second objective of crushing Palestinian nationalism as well. According to Rashid Khalidi, with the PLO's evacuation from Beirut, the Palestinian cause appeared to have been gravely weakened, and Sharon seemed to have achieved all of his core objectives. However, The paradoxical result of these events was gradually to shift the center of gravity of the Palestinian national movement away from the neighboring Arab countries, where it had been relaunched in the 1950s and 60s, moving it back inside Palestine. It was there that the first Intifada broke out 5 years later, in December 1987, with results that shook both Israeli and world public opinion. After a string of victories against Arab opponents in conventional wars, Lebanon was Israel's first unconventional war. It was also a very dirty war, the kind of war that is the hallmark of Israel today. Israel failed to achieve any of its objectives in this war despite incurring significant losses. But the barbarity exhibited and the destruction caused by Israel was reminiscent of Nazi operations against the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943 and the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. This cycle of Israeli brutality and Palestinian resistance continued with even greater vigor following Lebanon. In the next episode of Palestine versus Israel, we will discuss the First Intifada and the attempts to establish peace in Palestine through the framework of Oslo Accords. Stay tuned, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.